Gentleman had a second amendment he wishes to offer.
I do, and I'm prepared to offer it at this time as well. This is amendment number 006.
006. Clerk will report it. The gentleman's on a roll.
I'll reserve a point of order on.
Gentlelady from Colorado reserves a point of order.
I hope we can resolve this with an equal vote as we did the last one. Again, I hope that this is
without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized to explain.
Mr. Chairman, what this bill does, what this amendment does, is it adds really 3 words to the zero. It adds the words zero emissions energy after the words renewable, so that in fact, as we look to reduce our carbon footprint and emissions, we do it with more than just renewable. We also say zero emissions. So that would include coal, clean coal, something that we hope will have pretty close to zero emissions, particularly when we add carbon capture to it. Would add nuclear, which obviously has zero emissions as well. This is a job stimulus bill, and we know that there are literally tens of thousands, if not more than 100,000 jobs that would be added if we could increase our nuclear portfolio, nuclear energy across the country. So whether it be hydrogen, fuel cell vehicles, whether it be nuclear, whether it be hydro, a whole number of different things. We just say that if our goal is the same, that is renewable, we ought to also be looking at zero emissions and include that as part of this bill as it moves forward.
The gentleman yield to me.
I would be glad to yield.
This amendment is designed to promote nuclear power projects. No matter where you stand on nuclear energy issues, it doesn't really make sense to include new incentives for nuclear reactors in the economic recovery package. This is a bill for 2 years, and according to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, no permits for new nuclear reactors will be issued in the next 2 years. So it's not a question of the merits of the amendment, but it doesn't fit in this legislation. No amount of new federal incentives will change the fact that there are no projects ready, so there's no reason to include nuclear incentives in a package intended to stimulate the economy in the next 2 years.
Well, it could also, if the gentleman will yield, although it's still my time, carbon capture with clean coal could be considered on this. And I know that, as you indicated the other day, you're hoping to have a bill done in this committee by the end of May. A lot of those targets that were suggested in the U.S. cap, in fact, kick in by 2011. So I would think that clean coal technology, which we know can reduce emissions, could well be part of this. And again, it would add jobs.
Gentlemen, yield. There, in another provision in the bill, there's $2.4 billion for carbon capture. So this really is not the same situation.
Hang on a second.
Chairman, does the gentleman yield?
Be glad to yield.
Mr. Chairman, Fred, I'd like to ask the chairman a question, because if the bill is what he says is correct, it's only a 2-year bill, but that if for some reason there is a potential for a plant, that there's no intent to exclude a potential nuclear plant, getting the assistance if it's within the 2 years, no matter what the NRC Nuclear Regulatory Commission says. Mr. Chairman, if you yield, or if Fred were allowed to yield.
Controls the time will yield.
Yeah, I'll yield to the gentleman.
Well, the nuclear plants that come online before 2021 are eligible for a production tax credit of up to 1.8 cents per kilowatt hour for the first 8 years of their operation. But in addition, the Nuclear Power 2010 program pays up to half the nuclear industry's costs of seeking regulatory approval for new reactor sites, applying for new reactor licenses, and preparing detailed plant designs. So there are other guarantees available to nuclear power, but this loan guarantee program will sunset in 2 years, and nuclear power cannot meet this deadline and is already eligible for billions of dollars in incentives and subsidies. So I think we ought to preserve the stimulative intent of this program and not have this amendment in it, because it doesn't fit.
Mr. Chairman, I agree. I just didn't want us to inadvertently get into a debate or a yes or no on nuclear power, since it's not really pertinent for the next 2 years. So,
That's
Mr.
correct.
Chairman, if I might just ask for an additional minute to respond, since I yielded.
Without objection, gentleman's recognized.
I'd just like to make the point that when we started on nuclear power a number of decades ago and we built plants around the country, 85% of those components in those facilities were made in America. Since then, we really turned the light from green to red on new nuclear construction. And because of that, when and if a new nuclear plant becomes online, and I was in Mr. Dingell's district earlier this last year and looked at a plant that a new application had been filed, and I believe that there's 8 or 10, in fact, that are close to be coming filed with the NRC. Today, when we build those new plants, if they are allowed to proceed, which I hope they are, 85% of those components are going to come from someplace else, not the U.S. And that's one of the reasons why the pipe fitters, the steel workers, a whole number of different union organizations support nuclear power, because they know that those, when we turn that green light on, back on nuclear power, those jobs are going to be here. And if we can tell them, in fact, that we're close to turning that switch back to green, those steel companies in Pennsylvania and Indiana, I mean, the nuclear engineers that we graduate, particularly from our Big Ten universities, but other places around the country, they're going to know that there's going to be a job for them. And these are good paying jobs. So the quicker we send the signal, and that's why I think, you know, as we look at France, which is pretty close to 90% of their electricity comes from nuclear power, we know that this is emission-free, no carbon release. This is something that we ought to proceed on, that the more signals we send that it's going to happen by including this zero emission, knowing that it's more than just nuclear, because it is clean coal, it is hydrogen, fuel cells, a whole number of different things. It sends the signal to the right folks that, yes, we're ready to bring those people back into the workforce. And I'd like to think that we could include this. I know my minute has expired, and I'm going to ask for a recorded vote on this as well.
Mr.
Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my reservation.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady withdraws her reservation for a point of order.
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition? Yes, Mr. Doyle.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'd strike the last word. I want to just say that I want to speak in support of the sentiments being expressed by Mr. Upton. Fact of the matter is in the next 2 years, there are going to be many, many jobs created in anticipation of new nuclear plant construction. Companies, as we speak, are expanding their existing manufacturing facilities and engineering centers in North Carolina, Indiana, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Tennessee, and Louisiana. And we're talking about high-quality, skilled craft and engineering jobs, estimated to be somewhere between 14,000 to 15,000 new jobs being created by the end of this year and into next year. The U.S. CAP made it very clear in their report, and this is going to be our blueprint for our climate change legislation, that none of what we're talking about works without a balanced approach, and nuclear is certainly part of that balance that we talk about. Now, we all support this grant program for renewable energy. I don't know anybody that opposes it, and I support it 100%. But we are talking about a zero emissions, zero greenhouse gases being emitted right in the state of Pennsylvania. Westinghouse is making the AP 1000 for every country in the world except the United States of America. And they just hired 3,000 employees in the last year or two at Westinghouse in Pittsburgh to build these AP 1000s, creating good jobs, for family-sustaining jobs for Americans right here in our country. It's part of the mix. It's not the answer. It's part of the package. And anything we can do to facilitate the creation of power that doesn't emit greenhouse gases deserves our consideration. I just want to voice my support for the sentiments being expressed by Mr. Upton. Whether or not the answer is to fund them in this stimulus package may be a question of debate. But
Gentleman, yield to
no
me.
debate about that.
Gentleman, yield.
Yes, I will.
I want to identify myself with your remarks. We do need a balance, a whole portfolio of different energy sources, and nuclear will be part of that. Some of the unions that originally supported this amendment told us they were withdrawing their support once they realized that nuclear has a lot of other loan guarantees and money to assist them. The question was asked, what harm does it do if you add this in there? We don't really know. It might confuse things. if I might just ask the gentleman from Michigan to withdraw the amendment, let's look at it a little bit more carefully and see if it's needed. If it's not needed, then why put it in there? If it does no harm, why object? If it does some harm, then that should be a concern for all of us.
Well, I know you have a deadline today of reporting it, so when would all this happen?
Well, I would,
Get it into the bill and knowing that it could be on the floor as early as Tuesday.
yeah, I think we should.
Shall we? Why don't we accept it and see what happens?
Well, we're going to get to the medical sections in a while, and one of the things in medicine is to do no harm.
Yeah, yeah.
So why don't we? Well, I'm going to oppose the amendment just on that basis, but I respect what you're
Yeah,
trying to do.
If I could just echo just two things that my friend Mr. Doyle.
Yeah, I'll reclaim my time and I'll yield to Mr. Upton.
You know, you make a great point, and as I think about these reactor vessels that were once built in America, none of them are built here anymore. So, if we look to even keep nuclear energy at 20%, which is what the level is today,
this year, 2005.
when we have to build 54 new plants by the year 2030 to maintain 20%. Yet we have to go overseas for all these parts. We have to go to Japan, we have to go to Korea to have these things built. There is such a long queue. When I was in China last year or the year before, I was told that they were going to build 100 new nuclear plants by the year 2030. So you know that there's world pressure on this. The quicker we send a signal that we're going to get back on track, have a balance, as Chairman Waxman said, the better we are to create these jobs here in America, to have those skilled tradespeople, men and women, and to send that signal. So I would like to think that we could vote on this. I know we have a lot of amendments. We'll have a very quick vote. Hopefully it prevails and is part of the package, and we can move forward.
Well, reclaiming my time, Chairman Waxman, I appreciate your comments and your willingness to acknowledge that this is part of our package and that we'll work on it.
I thank you for that. I do want to point out that we've already authorized $18.5 billion in loan guarantees to cover 80% of nuclear plant construction costs, an additional $2 billion in loan guarantees for uranium enrichment facilities, and the loan guarantees for 2 years are directed at other renewable fuels. So I respectfully oppose the gentleman.
Would the gentleman yield?
There's no
Again,
cost to
quickly?
this.
And in
I have a
addition,
dollar figure.
in addition to what the chairman just added, the nuclear industry is eligible for 1.8 cents per kilowatt hour as a production tax credit generated from the first 8 years, electricity generated from the first 8 years of a nuclear power plant operation. And those plants come on, if those plants come online before 2021 under existing law that we passed in 2007 and 2005. The Nuclear Power 2010 program, already law, pays up to half of the nuclear industry's cost of seeking regulatory approval for new reactor sites, applying for new reactor licenses, and preparing detailed plant designs. The DOE has requested $241 million for Nuclear Power 210 in the fiscal year 2009, which is an increase of $107 million. They also receive up to $500 million in regulatory risk insurance and protection under the Price-Anderson Act. This section here is meant to deal with power transmission projects and renewable electricity, which was kind of left behind in the past, so that we could ensure that we have investment that's commensurate with that problem as well, which is why I recommend the same outcome that the chairman did for this section.
Are we ready for the question?
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks Mr. Barton?
Mr. Chairman, I rise, and I won't take 5 minutes, but I rise in support of the Upton Amendment. I'd ask the members to simply read it. It just adds the word zero emissions. Now, it doesn't say nuclear power. It just says zero emissions. And it is obvious on the face of it that a nuclear power plant doesn't have any emissions, so it would be eligible. So this is simply an eligibility addition, so it doesn't have a cost to it. It's just permissive. It's not mandatory. And I listened very closely to the chairman's objections, and I must admit less closely to Mr. Markey's objections, because I know what his objections are based on prior hearings. And our new chairman says the money won't be spent in 2 years. Well, if that's the standard, there's not a lot of this so-called stimulus package in this committee's jurisdiction we need to be moving today, because most of the money that's being authorized is not going to be spent in the next 2 years. So that's not a standard we can use unless we use it to the whole package, in which case, especially when we get to the health section, there wouldn't be a lot of the health section, from what I'm told, left. And so what Mr. Doyle says we need to listen to. We have an industry whose the technology's there. The reason they're not going to be nuclear power plant construction started is not because the workers aren't ready and the technology's not ready. It's because the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is taking so long to approve the protocol. And if this committee will exert its jurisdiction, we could cut that Gordian knot and actually have some applications approved within the next 12 to 13 months and construction permits hopefully going forward. So again, zero emissions adding as a definition is permissive, not mandatory, and I would hope that we could adopt this.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield to Mr. Shadegg.
I simply want to join you and rise in support of the gentleman's amendment. It seems to me that the discussion here is focused on nuclear, but that is not the language of the amendment. Quite frankly, the base bill does not define renewable energy, and it leaves me open to ask a question I've asked in this committee many times before, which has to do with the issue of hydropower. Hydropower is a renewable source of energy, and yet this committee at times has defined it as not a renewable source of energy. There are more and more high-tech applications of hydropower where in-stream flows can be tapped. I have my own amendment to add hydropower specifically and to deal with a number of other forms of energy which I think are renewable, which were set forth in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, but which appear not to be included in this definition. It seems to me that zero emissions makes all the sense in the world. It would help clarify the absence of a definition that I can find in this act, and I certainly rise in support of the gentleman's amendment.
Gentlemen, yield to me.
I yield to the chairman, sure.
Well, we've already authorized loan guarantees and money for nuclear power, and so they can come in and get access to that. This section of the bill is money that's designated for renewable sources of energy, and the amendment would say renewable and zero emission. I just think it confuses things. It doesn't appear to work in the context of the 2 years before this bill is sunsetted.
Maybe we should, if the gentleman will yield, maybe we should strike the word renewable and just have zero emissions.
Well, I think that we want to make sure that loan guarantees are there for renewable sources of energy, and not to have the money possibly put over to nuclear when they're not even going to be ready to access this money under this section. They can access it under other.
Will the gentleman yield?
Would the gentleman yield?
Will the gentleman yield?
Well, wait a minute. I'm going to yield.
Whose time is it?
It's time.
Yeah.
What little time I have, I'll yield to Ms. Eshoo.
Well, I just wanted to, thank you for yielding. I just wanted to restate something that maybe many of us have forgotten about now that it's a new year, and that is that $10 billion, with a B, $10 billion in loan guarantees were put out to the nuclear industry last year. So is that not enough? I mean, have all of these loan guarantees been taken up on? I mean, I'd say that not tongue-in-cheek, but that's a huge amount. So I just want to put that out there, and I appreciate your yielding time to me.
I've gotten 7 seconds. I'll yield to Mr. Shadegg.
I simply would ask the chairman, since he uses the word renewable power, does that in fact include hydropower?
Well, I don't know if it technically does, but it sounds to me like it should.
So you'd be open to an
the
amendment?
answer is yes.
Then I do have an amendment at the desk, and I'll be happy to offer.
You stated that sometimes it's considered as renewable, sometimes not. I'm not as well versed on the subject.
Mr. Chairman?
If you ask my thinking about it, you know, the water keeps coming. It's renewable.
I think it is renewable, and years ago on this committee I had to bring forth a copy of the hydrological cycle, which I took out of a third-grade text to try to persuade the committee to include hydro. So I have an amendment to do that, and I appreciate the chairman's answer.
Next time, don't use such advanced works.
Chairman?
The gentleman's time has expired. My staff informs me that they don't think it applies to hydro. I read that third grade book, and so that's where I got my opinion, but I'll have to rely on the experts on the subject.
Chairman?
We're ready.
Mr. Chairman?
I'm going to see if anybody on this side wants to be recognized. If not, who's seeking recognition? Mr.
Chairman?
Boyer.
I move to strike the last word. What I've done, I've gone and I've pulled the definition, the term of renewable energy system from the Energy Policy Act. Now, I want to ask the chairman, Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman, this term that someone now has placed in the base text on line 16, renewable energy systems, am I to assume that those three words were taken from out of the Energy Policy Act? Is that a fair assumption? Can staff help us here? Because in the Energy Policy Act, those three words
Let's have
defined.
counsel answer that. I believe they were, but let's have counsel's opinion.
And if that's the intent of the committee, we can pour through this really quick.
Okay.
That's right. While they're looking it up, Mr. Chairman, what I have in front of me is that the term renewable energy system means a system which, when installed in connection with a dwelling, transmits or uses solar energy, energy derived from geothermal deposits, energy derived from biomass, or any other form of renewable energy which the Secretary specifies by regulation for the purpose of heating or cooling such dwelling or providing hot water or electricity for the use within such dwelling. Now, what we have in front of us, the reason I've asked Mr. Chairman this question, is that the purpose of your loan guarantees is for commercial technology projects. So what we have, I go back to the word incongruent again, we have, if in fact we're going to be referring back to a definition out of the 05 Policy Act, it's in reference to residential dwellings for purpose of heating and heating water. If what we're trying to do is saying to the manufacturing sector of the country, Mr. Chairman, maybe it's a large manufacturer that has its own coal manufactured facility, that maybe they're willing to take that down and replace it with a wind or a solar farm, I think that's something that we would want them to do, but we would have a problem here within the definitions.
Gentlemen, may I ask if you would, if you yield for me
Sure,
a question.
do.
Were you reading from Title 17?
I can't answer that. My staff gave me the definition that was extracted from the Energy Policy Act of 05.
Does counsel have any views on the subject? Not views in terms of preferences, but clarifications as to the law?
There is a section of definitions in Title 17 which provides for the loan guarantee program. That section does not include a definition for renewable energy systems. If it is defined elsewhere in EPACT and perhaps is defined separately for the title in which it's defined. And may be defined more than one way, but we're not sure of that.
Well, then we have a challenge. I mean, seriously, we do. We have a challenge before us. If in fact our challenge is that these three words are defined in existing law and by regulation by the Secretary, we're about to use those three words again, yet we're not defining them. However, we want them to be used in commercial application. And so now we have ourselves at a bit of a challenge. We can't, this isn't something we can defer to the FCC or to somebody else. We ought to consider how we want to define these. Let me ask counsel, if in fact To the Council, we have these three words that are being used in this legislation, and we have existing regulation based off of the 05 Policy Act. What is your sense how this will be interpreted then by the Department of Energy?
Well, if the gentleman would yield to me, I'm being informed that the Department of Energy has sent out a solicitation for those who wish to take advantage of the funding, and they have set out the qualifications as they see it. Now, I don't know if we have that. I don't think it includes nuclear.
I'm not advocating. I'm just trying to figure out what the definition means. Will it include hydro, geothermal, solar, wind? You know, I'm struggling here to understand so I know what it's going to include, Mr. Waxman.
Okay. Council?
The use of the term in Title 17 creates the authority in the Secretary of Energy to define it for purposes of that title. There could be more than one way of defining it for different provisions of law. There indeed may be more than one application of renewable energy systems in different titles. The Department of Energy will issue regulations for loan guarantees, and in those regulations may well define the term with specificity. But we are not aware of any single definition of renewable energy systems that could be expected to define them throughout the entire federal code.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Further discussion of the Upton Amendment? Who seeks
Chairman.
recognition?
Mr. Chairman, over here.
Yes, gentleman.
Move to strike the
Walden.
last word. I want to continue on this discussion because perhaps we should, as the committee of jurisdiction that authorizes, define what we mean by renewable energy systems that generate electricity so that the agency knows, rather than wait for the agency of unelected people to dictate to us what they think this definition is and what they think we meant. I mean, I come from a region that relies heavily on hydroelectric power for its energy generation. That hydroelectric power it has a zero carbon footprint. It repeats itself as nature's cycle repeats. And yet even there we've had a debate over which hydro is renewable and which isn't, depending upon the age of the facility through which the water flows, which seems kind of, well, ridiculous. So I would go back to council and say, what would if the Department of Energy came to you and said, what did the committee mean by renewable energy systems that generate electricity, to what will you point in our transcripts to tell them what we meant?
There may be legislative history from the adoption of Title 17 and EPACT 05 that could shed light on that, but on an ex post facto basis, I don't think I would be able to guide them.
Because if I understood you right, you've told us that there may be various definitions of renewable energy in various places in the statute. And so is it correct to presume then that the agency will have to figure this out on their own, and then we'll decide later in an oversight hearing whether they got it right, in effect? I mean, are we delegating, that's probably not a fair question to you, are we delegating to them the authority to write a new definition or write a definition of what renewable energy systems that generate electricity that qualify for this loan guarantee program will be?
To the extent that there is not specific legislative history that would elucidate that, and to the extent Congress has not provided a specific definition, then, yes, you're delegating the authority to the Secretary of Energy and the administration of this program to define it.
And so am I correct then that that is exactly what we're doing here today? If we don't provide a further definition under renewable energy systems that generate electricity?
I am not aware of whether or not there is specific legislative history in the Title 17 enactment process.
So the agency will just be able to pick and choose what qualifies here. You don't have to answer that. I'll just make that statement. Once again, though, in the rush to get this out in a partisan way, I think we are not fulfilling our responsibility to the people whom we're borrowing this money from to spend it correctly. And so, Mr. Chairman, I would hope before this passes out of here that we'll have a fairly simple definition added in that tells us what's included and what's not. And then we can vote on it. We, who are actually representatives, can vote on what we think should be in here, rather than leave it up to the agency. With that, I yield back.
Gentlemen, yield to me.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, sir.
There already are loan guarantees authorized for advanced renewable energy systems. And what we're talking about in these loan guarantees is to commercially available renewable systems. If they're commercially available, it's to provide the stimulus for jobs and to get those systems going.
Reclaiming my time,
yes.
Then, there are modern hydro facilities. For example, there are new generators that are advanced. Would they qualify for a loan guarantee then?
Does council know? Well, let me ask here. As I understand it, the practice of the department in soliciting applicants has not included hydro.
There are small-scale nuclear electrical generating facilities. There's a company in my state that wants to sell commercially available small-scale nuclear. Would that qualify as renewable?
I think the answer would be no.
There are small-scale solar and small-scale wind. Would they qualify?
I think the answer would be yes.
There are biomass facilities that use woody biomass and generate electricity as a byproduct. Would that qualify? Commercially available today?
Well, your time is up. Mr. Markey is seeking recognition, and perhaps he can answer those questions in his time, because he understands it's a question that's pending.
I appreciate
and
that,
make
Mr.
further,
Chairman. I respect that.
Further comments.
I thank the gentleman very much, and I thank the gentleman for his interest in this area. The goal here is to look at solar, at wind, at geothermal, in order to put on a fast track, as part of a stimulus plan over the next 2 years, the kinds of projects that can create jobs and can be completed in a relatively brief period of time. Realistically, you can't say that about a nuclear power plant, though. It takes 8 to 10 years. Even these new technologies that the gentleman is talking about in their smaller form are still untested, and it will take some time before any one of those facilities is completed, at least 6 to 8 years. The same thing is true with hydropower. Hydropower, because of the siting issues, because of the environmental issues, because of the long process that has to unfold before there is a siting of a hydro project, also falls outside of the 2-year time frame for this stimulus package. There are issues that we can debate in other contexts in the course of the next 2 years in energy legislation. But for the purposes of this legislation, just understand that the context is in ensuring that there is a shovel-ready component to it. The regulatory process for hydro, understandably, because most of the easy hydro was built beginning in the 1830s up in my congressional district as Lowell and Lawrence and the other mills were beginning to be constructed, but through the TVA in the 1930s. So most of the easier sites have been completed. The remaining sites are principally those that are in much more environmentally sensitive areas. And so the goal that we have here is to keep our eye on the stimulus ball. Would the gentleman yield? Even in the area of nuclear, that's not a renewable to the extent to which it requires the mining of uranium, which is not a renewable resource, in order to provide that energy source. So this section is focused on renewables. It's focused upon the electric transmission. And I understand what the gentleman is saying, but just by definition, the goal here of the stimulus package, as opposed to everything else we're going to do after we finish it, is to have these projects begin and be completed over the next couple of years.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be glad to.
I want to make 2 points. One is to make just a correction, if I could, on small-scale hydro development. I have projects that have gone in my district in the last year as new inserts in piped irrigation systems that are now generating electricity. Some of those can go on. I mean, there's a lot of, they weren't controversial. They decided to pipe their canals and decided to put small-scale hydro inside the pipe. So now they generate renewable energy, they pressurize their systems, they're not having to pump as much, and the surplus waters now are going into the rivers.
Well,
so would that small-scale hydro qualify?
Okay, perhaps.
Woody biomass
facilities.
facilities.
You know what, we could talk about this. Perhaps incremental hydro, if that's what the gentleman is talking about. Perhaps that
I'm not talking the big main stem.
So perhaps,
Gentleman from Massachusetts has the time.
Perhaps incremental
I thought he yielded to me. I'm
hydro.
sorry,
but,
Mr. Chairman.
But again, we're talking there in relatively small.
Right. So if you would yield,
Sure.
my question is then, I'm just trying to get clarification on what's covered by this language and what's not. So is incremental small-scale hydro, would they be available to take advantage of the loan guarantee program or not?
Okay. And if the gentleman would just give us a little bit of time to work on that issue, that is this incremental issue, then we may be able to come back to you with an affirmative answer. Okay.
But aren't we on a time limit today?
We are on a time limit. I'm talking about over the next hour or so.
Then let me add, if I might, sir, add one other, and that is woody biomass. I have mills that use the woody biomass to generate now in a cogeneration capability electricity. So as they are retooling and refinancing and rebuilding their facilities, would woody biomass, even if that wood comes off federal land, qualify for loan guarantees so that they could move forward on very low emission boilers that produce a byproduct of electricity and steam?
Again, if I may go back to the gentleman once again, woody biomass as well is something. If it could be done,
gentleman,
if it could be completed within a couple of years, could be eligible for this program as well.
So it would be under this definition.
I would say yes.
Well, the gentleman,
because I know that with wind and solar sightings that's going on in my district, those are multi-year efforts too.
I would say yes, and it would also be the intent that energy production processes like that would be covered. Yes.
Well, the gentleman,
Gentleman's time has expired. We've spent 45 minutes so far on this title, and I know there are other amendments.
Mr. Chairman, just an inquiry of the chairman.
Mr. Blunt.
Mr. Chairman, on this and on the previous section, we've had so many questions that we decided we need to get answers for, but we have such a short time. Is there some deadline here about when this bill has to come to the floor? I mean, why can't we have more time to have answers to these questions so we could decide whether this committee needs to have impact on the legislation or not, as opposed to just somebody in some point in the future working out what happens here? Is there a timeline here that we've been asked to work with that I'm not aware of, and could you
Our
help
leadership
us
has
understand
informed
that?
us that tomorrow they're going to go to the Rules Committee. Next week they're going to take up the bill. They're trying to accommodate the schedule set out by the new President of the United States, who has argued that we need a stimulus package as quickly as possible to move the economy forward. And in that regard, he's been backed by many economists. I sympathize with the gentleman's concerns. I've been on the other side of the fence on this in this committee, in the minority, and it would be desirable to have a lot of hearings and talk things through and be more deliberative. And I was critical at times when the Republicans rammed through bills without the full deliberation, but at their insistence of their leadership. But we're faced with not just a leadership demand, we're faced with an imperative by the American people that we do something about the economy right away. And this provision that we're discussing is to provide loan guarantees to encourage commercially available renewable fuels and to give them loans to get going, not because they happen to be in any member's district, but because they will have the greatest impact on the overall economy.
Well, Mr. Chairman, we all know how difficult those Republican leaders were, and we've emerged beyond that. But we've never had a piece of legislation anywhere near this big or this financially impactful. And the idea that the deadline is tomorrow is an amazing thing. And I thank the chairman for answering the question.
Thank you. Are we ready for the vote on the pending Upton amendment? All those in favor of the Upton amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. You want a show of hands?
Why don't we do a roll call? We'll
You run a roll
be
call?
quick. Yep.
Okay, gentleman asked for a roll call. Let's have the roll call.
Mr. Waxman? No. Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingle? No. Mr. Dingle, no. Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Gordon? Mr. Rush? Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Stupak? No. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel? No. Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green? No. Mr. Green, no. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette, no. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon? Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, no. Mr. Space? Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Deal? Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Boyer? Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Radonovich, aye. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack? Ms. Bono Mack, aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick? Mrs. Myrick, aye. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, aye.
Members who have not responded to the roll wish to be recognized. Mr. Matheson?
Mr. Matheson votes no.
Mr. Rush? Mr. Gordon?
Rush votes no. Mr. Gordon votes no.
Mr. Pallone?
Mr. Gordon votes no.
Mr. Whitfield?
Oh, Pallone, I'm sorry. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Whitfield votes aye.
Any member wish to be recognized? Mr. Boyer? Mr. Boyer votes
Boyer
aye.
votes aye.
All members respond to the roll? If so, clerk will tally and report the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 21 and the nays were 33.
Ayes 21, nays 33. The amendment is not agreed to.